What's good, YouTube? It's me, your boy Squiddy, back in another Squiddio. The pros on Twitter are saying this format is trash. Do you guys agree? I mean, I thought I'd make this to get a bigger snapshot of the community's thoughts on the pros actually talking about this. But from what I've seen, basically, they think this format is not good because there's a wide variety of decks, and it's really, really hard to account for, especially when all of these decks basically have insta-win combos off of one or two cards. With little investment, they can put up a huge board, and it's very, very hard for you going second to deal with that. Not to mention, because all of these decks are different and interact differently with each other, you do not have enough room in the main deck and the side deck to accommodate and account for all of them by playing non-engine cards, right? Like, the way I see it is currently, a lot of the decks, when they go first, they put up a huge board, and you require at least two non-engine pieces to actually have a chance of breaking past that and surviving, possibly even trying to win the game. But it's very, very hard because these cards are often very, very specific, and when you do not have an exact combination of those cards against a certain matchup, it can be very hard. For example, if you're playing against Tearlaments and they have Suliek, a card like Cosmic Cyclone might help here, whereas a card like Cosmic Cyclone doesn't really do much against a deck like Rescue Ace when they just set 4 back rows that more or less do the same thing and still disrupt you. So one Cosmic is not going to be enough. Whereas cards like Thrust or Talents might be better in certain matchups and worse in others. It's worse against decks like Flunderies, but probably better against a deck that plays lots of hand traps. So it's very, very hard for you to build your deck to account for everything. And personally, I think this format is not too great because of that reason, and how going first, basically every deck has a way to make a crazy board, whether it's through a full combo, through a control-based scenario where they're recurring a bunch of cards back in their hand for follow-up, like Rescue Ace or Unchained, or they're just crazy mills, you know, Tearlaments, just making it so you cannot win because their combo is so strong. Now, if you think about it, there are actually a lot of decks in the format, okay? Like, off the top of my hand, I could probably count a bunch. Like, looking at the top 32 decks in YCS Indie, there were actually at least 10 decks, if I'm not mistaken. There's Rescue Ace, which is obviously a best deck by a landslide, but there's still a bunch of other decks that can still compete with it on a major scale, or at least on a locals or regional level. Rescue Ace, Unchained, Tearlaments, Dragon Link, Vanadium, Purely, even other decks like Vanquish Soul. Like, people are still playing Salamangreats. There are other obscure decks like Chimera Branded, even like Marincess. You know, there are a bunch of different decks. Sprite variants, Runics, I can go on, so on and so forth. All of these decks have a similar power level, but what they have in common is going first, they put up a crazy board because of how crazy the power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten. And I feel like it's almost like a design flaw where formats like this would benefit a lot if we had cards to deal with them going second. But unfortunately, the way Yu-Gi-Oh! Has progressed, it's impossible to deal with everything off of one card because everything has been diversified. All of the interrupts have been not only monster effects, but also back rows, hand traps, you know, like graveyard effects, things like that. You can't deal with everything nowadays. And previously, I think they were trending towards the right direction by printing things like Dark Ruler No More, which dealt with negate boards that were very popular back in the day. You know, you had like the Thunder Dragon stuff, which is basically all monster negates. But now that we have more stuff like Suliek, we have Vanadium Reframing, we have the Rescue Ace, Omni negates in the form of Baron de Fleur, and potentially Borreload Savage Dragon plus set 4. And then on top of that, all of the decks have insane follow-up. It's very, very hard for a player going second, not only to break the board, but also mount a force enough that it deals with the follow-up. Like, every deck has minimal investment nowadays. Off one card, you're getting a full board with still 4 or 5 cards in hand. So it's like, okay, I have to deal with your board. I have to deal with your hand traps that you might have in hand, like Ash Blossom or Nibiru. And then on top of that, I have to survive an additional turn. It's just like, I don't know. It's a lot to ask. And for me, I definitely agree with the sentiment that's going around on Twitter, where it's just a little bit vast, too vast. We have like crazy formats like this very rarely where there's a lot of decks. We have had formats that have 3 decks. It's like rock, paper, scissors. We had like Orchest, Sky Striker. We had the Goki formats as well. In the past, if you played, we had tier 0 formats as well, like Tearlaments or Dragon Ruler Spellbooks. Or even further beyond that, we had the triangle formats with Dino Rabbit, Windup, and Inzektor. So players have been traditionally used to these formats where you just have to side for a couple of decks, but now it's like there's just so much to deal with. It's really, really hard. But I think, personally, it's better for the casual and average players. Obviously, they feel a lot more inclined to play when you're able to kind of whip up your own mash, your own brew of deck, and do relatively well at it on a local scale. And then from an audience perspective, watching the content in the streams, it's a lot more exciting to see a variety of decks faced against each other rather than seeing mirror matches of the top decks or the same 2 or 3 decks over and over. It gets very, very boring and mundane. And looking at deck profiles, you know, you don't want to see like, oh, another Rescue Ace deck, boring. People want to see spice. That's always been how Yu-Gi-Oh! Is. I think competitively, deck building has been a huge component of it, not only for getting an edge in the actual tournament, but also for the purpose of showing off and for the community to see, wow, this is a really interesting way that they kind of solve the metagame. So it kind of is a better option, I think, for casuals and also for players that are starting to play from Master Duel. They see that there's a variety of decks, so they have a lot more excitement just seeing like the variety, seeing different things. You're not seeing the same thing over and over. So those are my thoughts on the actual issue and why people are saying that this format is not good. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on this as a whole. Like, if you guys play at a local level or if you play at a competitive level, let us know in the comments below. Like, is this actually a bad format? Is there any way we can solve this format? Do you enjoy this format personally? Because that's, at the end of the day, you know, if you're enjoying playing Yu-Gi-Oh, that's what matters, right? It doesn't really matter about other people's opinions, but if we're having fun and we're winning or losing and still having fun, then that's all that matters, right? So yeah, I thought I'd make this video just to get the community's thoughts. Other than that, we'll see you all